Welcome to The Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner, and today I have a special guest, Clint Hermes. Welcome, Clint.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, this program is arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. And I've never talked to someone who does exactly what you do. You're an attorney,
Right.
and off your website, Biomedical Research Regulatory Matters. So I know there is such a thing. I've, attended the IRB when I've had to get a clinical research protocol approved. But I know your firm also deals with international. I mean, to me, that just sounds like a giant headache. Not only, do you have city, county, state, federal, and now you're talking about different countries, different languages, different sets of rules and regulations. So that's what we're going to talk about. But before we get there, I want you to tell me who you are, what's your background, and how did you get, into this line of work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I give a little bit of context. Law schools don't, at least in the 1990s, law schools didn't really have a mechanism to specialize, and and particularly in the first part of your JD program is entirely set in stone. Um, and I guess by comparison, the post JD training of a lawyer is not nearly as structured as the post MD training is of a doctor. And so you sort of go into law school knowing that when you come out the other end, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what you might be able to do. And so when I went into law school, I really actually had no idea what it was that I wanted to do, and I went to a number of different career panels on, corporate and litigation and intellectual property. And I ended up going to one on healthcare. And there was one of the attorneys who spoke at the healthcare career panel, this really fascinating portfolio of the sort of things that she dealt with. And, biomedical, bioethical issues, and genetics and stem cell and organ transplantation. And actually now she's the CEO of the New England Organ Bank. And so I decided that I decided essentially that was what I wanted to do. And so after law school, I did an internship and then ended up getting a job at the law firm that she was at. That was where I sort of started my career and sort of getting into this field of the regulation of biomedical research. And then ultimately I ended up working at two different academic medical centers, including St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, where you are.
Oh yeah, right down the street.
Right.
And that's a very impressive and organization with lots of talented people. So who would be, for example, one of your clients? Who would hire you?
Sure. So the types of clients that I would do work for are really any organization that is involved in biomedical research, and so that could be a drug or device company that is sponsoring a clinical trial. It could be a university that has research going on in its labs. It could be, obviously teaching hospitals that are the sites of a lot of research, but also even, a lot of research nowadays is being done in smaller physician practice settings. And so really any of those.
So, all right, well, let's just dive right into it. In my experience, I did clinical research and development of epilepsy drugs. I'm an epilepsy specialist, and I would have to go to the IRB with this protocol, and they would, want 4,000 copies and spread it around, and it would take months. And then, this was really a standard study that's being done at 30 sites across the US. And I really couldn't understand it. It's like every single site had to go through their own IRB,
Yep.
and
Yep.
recreate the wheel. And the whole idea was, for, is it an appropriate study and are they protect, there's this idea of human subject abuse that I want to talk to you a little bit. I mean, is that really still a problem? That studies that go through pharmaceutical, I mean, that they don't watch out for the safety of the patients. I mean, isn't that sort of like, fasten your seatbelt, I mean, a checklist thing? I mean, is it still important to go through all that?
Yeah, so so I think there's a few different issues to unpack there. I mean, so I want to acknowledge that from the standpoint of an investigator who has an idea about a study they want to do, or has been approached by a company and wants to participate as a site in the study, um, the regulatory burdens associated with that may seem significant, and in some cases just sort of nonsensical. I mean, so you gave a really good example, I think, of a multi-site study where each site is having to use its own IRB. And in fact, actually, there have been recent regulatory changes at the federal level that in many cases now mandate a single central IRB for multi-site studies. So that is now sort of the default for all federally funded studies, and is becoming, I think, a pretty standard approach for non-federally funded studies as well. Because there's not, particularly for research that happens in the U.S., I think there's a consensus that the pros of having single IRB review kind of outweigh there are a few disadvantages of doing it that way, but I think the consensus is that single IRB review is a good thing, and it helps investigators. Um, there there are a number of other sort of regulatory burdens, I think, that investigators experience aside from the IRB review, depending on the type of research they're doing. So I was mentioning just a second ago, federally funded research, right? So federally funded research has a lot of, with the money that comes from the federal government, there are an awful lot of strings attached in terms of pre and post award compliance, and that can be a real burden on the investigator and on the institution where the investigator works. And there's a lot of other, there's regulations pertaining to conflicts of interest and regulation. There's a whole landscape here that goes obviously quite a bit beyond just the IRB. And so, I think your question is, so what are we purchasing with all of this regulatory compliance effort? What are we preventing? There obviously has been a history of a lot of abuse in terms of human subjects research, going back, I think probably a lot of people are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study, but there's lots of others that have involved the U.S. government. The U.S. government actually ran a study in Guatemala that was basically the same as the Tuskegee syphilis study that was recently acknowledged by the Obama administration. And I'm not saying it was done during the Obama administration. It was done. It was apologized for during the Obama administration. But there have been lots of other examples of the U.S. government and more recently of private actors engaging in questionable research practices. Now, I think that because of regulation, a lot of the most egregious abuses have stopped or have decreased significantly. There have been a few cases, even in the 2000s, of universities doing things that are pretty bad. But by and large, that has stopped. And now I think what you're dealing with is smaller lapses in research ethics that are nothing like nothing like the Tuskegee syphilis study, but are nevertheless things that we should be working to improve. And it's not even a lot of these regulations aren't even just aimed at unethical research. They are aimed at ensuring data integrity and product safety and things like that.
For those who aren't familiar, I did some research before this talk about the Tuskegee study where people were infected with syphilis for the purpose of seeing what's the natural history. And at that time, there really wasn't much of a treatment. But when penicillin became available, they didn't get it. And they weren't told it was available. And they were just, let's just see what happens.
That's
So it
right.
was like, well, it was important, kind of observational study from a scientific point of view. But given that the subjects were not informed that a treatment was now available for this progressive infection, really, I think, unethical by anyone's standards.
Yeah, and even we're actively lied to about the nature of their condition and
Ah,
what done about
hmm.
it. And I think you will probably know this better than I do, but I think penicillin became available in the maybe in the 1940s.
It was around the
Um,
wartime.
yeah, and the syphilis study went on into the early 1970s, and so this was not a brief period of time where they were doing this.
Right. Now, I wonder, I saw from your resume you have a lot of interest in international work. Personally, I've spent a lot of time in the Philippines doing medical mission work, some scuba diving. Um, but I'm interested, have you personally worked overseas? And then my other, things tend to be a lot looser. What we consider to be ethical often might be different, certainly in business practices, in other countries. So,
Yeah.
is that, can you address some of that?
Yeah, so actually, I lived overseas for the last 7 years up until about the end of last year. So I was living and working at a Cornell University affiliated teaching hospital in the Middle East, and I was there from sort of early 2013 until, like I said, just the end of 2019. But I have also done myself a great deal of work on behalf of clients in a number of countries around the world, but particularly in the developing world. And so I have spent a lot of time in a number of countries in Africa and Southeast Asia in particular, and some as well in Latin America and the Middle East, doing work on behalf of clients. And so I'm happy to. I think it's a fascinating area. I'm happy to talk more about it. I mean, one of the areas where, I mean, just going back to your earlier question of, do these research abuses continue? Like I said, I think that the number and the egregiousness of the abuses has dramatically decreased in the United States. I think that it is probably decreased in the developing world as well, but not on the same time frame. And so I think that you can find much more recent, fairly egregious abuses by very well-known U.S. pharmaceutical companies doing things in developing countries that they would not be able to do here because the regulations are not as clear. Even in some cases, if the regulations are clear in a developing country, the enforcement mechanisms really aren't there, and so forth.
Uh, right. So, do you have any experience with the Philippines? That's a country I know the most about, or anywhere near there?
Southeast Asia, yes, but not the Philippines specifically. I have not actually done work in the Philippines.
What about research fraud? I mean, that's another issue where every now and then you read in the New England Journal that they withdrew the paper because the guy made up the data. I mean, it just seems just incredulous. This whole autism thing, for example, is based on a physician in the UK who just
Right.
created this out of nothing, and and it won't go away. So, I mean, research fraud is really undermines legitimate research, and it's dangerous. I mean, how does it get that far?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually a whole body of regulations in an office within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services called the Office of Research Integrity that oversees this when you have federally funded research, and their term for this is scientific misconduct, and the scientific and but really it's their definition of scientific misconduct is a fairly narrow definition of really clear abuses like uh, plagiarism and falsification and fabrication. And a lot of that, I think one of the areas they're particularly concerned about is the manipulation of photos, and so enhancing the contrast of like part of an image and leaving the rest of it the way it is, or stuff or stuff that's even more obvious. Um, there are a number of what I would call, adjacent practices that are not, active like plagiarism or making up data, that are, things like ghostwriting or not disclosing conflicts of interest, or, people, this is not obviously a scientific term, but like cooking the data, right? I mean, so, selectively using data. So you're not making it up. You're not falsifying the data, but you are not presenting the full picture of the data that were developed during the research. And those are, they're the policing mechanisms for that kind of stuff, particularly when it's not federally funded, are really left to institutions and to journals, and so it's often not caught until after the fact. But I mean, the example you gave of vaccines and autism is really highlights, I think, the cost that this kind of behavior can have. And by the way, there have actually been some there have actually been some empirical studies, survey research of sort of asking researchers, have you ever done anything like this on an anonymous basis, or do you suspect a colleague of ever having done anything like this? And the numbers are pretty astounding. And so you get something like around 2% of people admit to having plagiarized or falsified data. I think the numbers were like a third of people suspect that, or maybe a quarter or a third of people suspect that a colleague has done it. And so, it's quite prevalent. And I think it just, it speaks to the incentives that people have to, sort of publish or perish.
Let's talk for a minute about vaccines, because today is April 17th. This program won't air for a while, but of course, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 infection, and there's a lot of energy being spent trying to urgently develop a vaccine. Now, one of my concerns as a physician is that, it's going to be sloppy whenever you do things in a hurry. In the Philippines, for example, there's been a problem trying to develop the dengue vaccine where they had one, but it actually made people worse because it wasn't as good as it ought to have been.
Yeah, no, I
And
know about that case. Yeah.
and maybe they were in a hurry. So what's happening now? Say I want to make a vaccine. Okay, I've got a little, my lab in the back room there, and I'm going to make a vaccine for this for SARS-2. What papers do I have to file in order to get it approved?
Right. So there are actually a lot of vaccine candidates out there now. I mean, I think the last time I checked, which was just a few days ago, there was over 100 vaccine candidates under investigation. Now, when I say that, I mean, there's a single digit number that are in human clinical trials. There are a whole lot more that are either under investigation in a lab or in sort of preclinical studies, which usually means animal models. I mean, if you manage to make a vaccine in your basement, essentially what you have to do is you have to go to, and you want to test it in humans. You have to get what's called an IND, which is an investigational new drug application approved by the Food and Drug Administration. So they're going to request from you all sorts of, if you want to test in humans, they're going to want preclinical data. They're going to want good manufacturing practice data. There's a whole raft of information they're going to want to see about the product itself. How we know it's safe, and what your investigation plan is for your phase 1 study.
All right. Well, I just have one final question. I was reviewing your bio, and I see that you graduated from Yale University,
I did.
as did I, although I suspect we weren't in the same class. And then you graduated from Harvard Law School. So the
Yes.
question is, which side, of the arena do you sit on for the Harvard Yale game?
Oh, without question, it's Yale every time.
All right, all right. So go Bulldogs, go
I think people
Bulldogs.
have, people. I think people just naturally have a lot more affinity for their undergraduate institution than for at least for their law school. I'll just put it that way.
So Clint, how would so when I do get a little further with my vaccine production project, or if there are others who are really into this biomedical regulatory world, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on. So I work at a firm called Bassberry and Sims, and they have their website is bassberry.com. It's spelled really just like it sounds. And you can find me on that website, and my email address is clint.hermes@bassberry.com.
Well, Clint, this has really been enlightening, and I've enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks for being on the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.